Hi everybody, welcome and thank you for joining me tonight. As you settle into your blankets, fluff your pillows, and perhaps listen to the rain gently tapping against your window or a soft breeze brushing against the curtains, I invite you to drift back in time with me. Tonight, and in the nights to come, we'll wander through forgotten chapters of history, pages that are quietly absurd, gently strange, and often unexpectedly tender. This is not a story of grand conquests or triumphant rulers. No. Instead, we'll explore the softer side of royalty, their most human moments, especially the ones where pride met misfortune, and where power could not prevent the peculiar, the clumsy, or even the embarrassingly final. This is a tale of the most embarrassing royal deaths in history. But don't worry, we won't dwell on darkness or fear. Rather, we'll find the humor, the softness, and the deeply human absurdity that binds us all. So, with the softest of chuckles and the gentlest of sighs, let us begin. With a man who quite sincerely ate himself to death, a king with a sweet tooth, Adolf Frederick of Sweden, imagined the royal palace of Stockholm on a cold winter's evening in February 1771. The city outside is quiet, blanketed in soft snow that mutes the sounds of horses' hooves and muffles the voices of passers-by. The lanterns glow like warm embers, flickering gently through the frosty haze. Inside the palace, candles cast golden shadows on polished floors. The fire crackles in a great stone hearth. The scent of roasted meats and baked sweets fills the air. In the dining room, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden is seated comfortably at the head of a long oak table. He is not a fierce man, nor particularly bold. In fact, many called him the king who ruled without power, as Sweden at the time was governed by the Riksdag, the country's parliament. Adolf, by contrast, preferred quieter things: wood carving, reading, walking, and above all, eating. Adolf loved food in the way poets love verses or composers love a final chord. It was, by all accounts, a passion both sincere and boundless. That night he indulged himself more than usual. His dinner began with lobster, plump, perfectly pink and buttery. Then came caviar, salty and decadent, served on rounds of bread with sweet cream. Afterward he enjoyed a hearty portion of sauerkraut, followed by smoked meats, salted herring, and perhaps a few delicate cheeses. And he wasn't done. To wash it all down, he had champagne, chilled and fizzy, poured into crystal glasses. But it was dessert that sealed his fate. The dessert that ended a dynasty. Enter the semla bun. In Sweden, semla is a beloved pastry, especially during the season leading up to Lent. It's a soft, cardamom-spiced wheat bun, sliced open and filled with rich almond paste and generous clouds of whipped cream. Traditionally, it's served in a bowl of warm milk, creating a dish called hetväg. The bun itself is delightful, fragrant, sweet, tender. The warm milk softens its edges, and the almond paste adds a touch of nutty richness. One semla is a satisfying indulgence. King Adolf Frederick had 14. Yes, 14. 14 semlor, to be precise, each carefully drowned in its bowl of milk, each eaten with the kind of pleasure only a true enthusiast could understand. The courtiers nearby might have smiled politely, perhaps exchanged glances, but no one dared interrupt the king's joy. And then, after his feast, after this royal tribute to culinary delight, the king leaned back in his chair. He smiled, and, quietly, in the most curiously tragic of finales, he died. Death by dessert, fact or folklore. Now historians have debated this tale. Was it truly the dessert that did him in? Official reports mention digestive problems, a vague phrase even in 18th century Sweden. But oral tradition and the collective imagination have preserved the story of the 14 buns. It's become a curious part of Swedish heritage. To some, it's a cautionary tale. To others, a kind of odd national joke. The idea that a monarch, meant to be dignified, wise, perhaps even divine, could be brought low not by rebellion, not by war, but by whipped cream. And yet, doesn't that make him strangely endearing? Adolf wasn't a tyrant. He didn't wage ruinous wars or oppress his people. He carved snuff boxes. He walked in the palace gardens. He enjoyed puzzles. His greatest fault? Perhaps an over-enthusiastic love for dessert. In a world of emperors remembered for cruelty or conquest, isn't there something gently human about a king who simply ate too much and died with a full stomach? A quiet legacy after his death, the court tried to preserve his dignity. They avoided mentioning the Semla incident in official records. They spoke instead of sudden illness. But the people whispered, and over time, the whisper became folklore. Today, when Swedes celebrate Fat Tuesday by eating semla, many remember Adolf Frederick. Some do so fondly, others with a quiet laugh. But all recognize the curious place he holds in history, not as a warrior, not as a builder of empires, but as the man who reminds us, gently, humorously, that we are all mortal, that even the most powerful among us can be undone by something as small and as delicious as a pastry. And so we drift as you begin to drift into sleep. Let your thoughts wander to that snowy night in Stockholm. Picture the flickering candlelight, the gently falling snow, and a table set with linen and silver and far too many semla buns. Let your mind rest on the image of a man content, perhaps too content, whose last evening was filled with the things he loved most. Not a bad way to go, really. While the tale of King Adolf Frederick gave us a gentle chuckle and a craving for almond cream, our next story shifts to the cloudy skies of Georgian England, a land of powdered wigs, tea-drinking nobility, and, yes, another royal demise that veered awkwardly into the bizarre. This time, it wasn't dessert that did the deed, it was the privy. Yes. Tonight we meet a monarch who died not in battle, nor in his bed, but in the bathroom. Let us turn our eyes now to King George II of Great Britain. Morning at Kensington Palace. It was a crisp October morning in 1760. The leaves in Hyde Park rustled with a golden whisper. London stirred gently, with servants lighting fires, chimneys beginning to smoke, and carriages rolling over damp cobblestones. Inside Kensington Palace, the king had risen early. He was a creature of habit. At 77 years old, George, too, followed a routine as precise as a watchmaker's tick. He had his morning chocolate, a fashionable drink at court, thick and spiced, and then retired to his private closet. Now, a closet in 18th century royal language didn't mean a wardrobe or a storage room. It meant, quite literally, the lavatory, a chamber with a wooden seat, a pot below, and perhaps a window just barely open to let in the London air, and it was there, amid the tiles and shadows, that the king's heart betrayed him. A sudden collapse. A loud thump echoed through the halls. Servants rushed in, alarmed, only to find the king collapsed in a most undignified position, having suffered an aortic aneurysm, a sudden and massive rupture near the heart. He was taken to his bed, where he died within hours. There was no dramatic farewell, no whispered final words, no regal setting with courtiers lined in silence. Just the echo of footsteps in a hallway and the awkward hush of a palace staff, uncertain how to announce a royal death that had occurred so undramatically. The news traveled quickly. The king is dead. But how he died, on the privy, was a detail that both embarrassed and amused in equal measure. Legacy of a bathroom exit now, George II was not the most beloved monarch in British history. His German accent never quite softened, and his cold demeanor was often mocked. But he was steady. He had ruled for over 3 decades and had seen Britain grow into an empire of global weight. He had clashed often with his son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, so bitterly, in fact, that when Frederick died before him, George reportedly muttered, "I'm glad to be rid of him." The two were never close, and the tension between father and son was a defining mark of George's reign. And so, it was perhaps fitting, in the strange poetic logic of history, that George's death, sudden and devoid of grandeur, mirrored the unceremonious way he often approached life. The Georgian toilet, a curiosity of its own. Now, pause with me a moment here. You might be wondering, what was a royal toilet actually like in 1760? To imagine this, picture not a gleaming white porcelain bowl but a carved wooden bench set within a small chamber. Beneath the seat, a chamber pot. Velvet cushions, perhaps, for comfort. Sometimes, even a foot warmer for those particularly cold mornings. There were no flushing systems, of course. Servants were responsible for cleaning the pot. And though it might sound unpleasant to modern ears, the royal privy was considered a private sanctuary, often where monarchs read, thought, and escaped the politics of the court for a few precious minutes of solitude. So while George II's final moments may strike us today as humorous, in his time, the lavatory was not such a ridiculous setting. Still, it was not the farewell befitting a sovereign, which, oddly enough, is precisely what makes the story memorable. The irony of royal dignity: monarchs spent lifetimes preserving image. Their portraits were carefully posed, their words measured, their deaths, ideally, noble and serene. To die in one's bed, surrounded by candlelight and a priest, was the aspiration. But reality, ever unscripted, has a way of deflating even the most stately of plans. George's death became an early example of royal rumor gone viral. Whispers in London parlors, knowing smiles at tea tables. The papers reported the cause respectfully, but the people, they remembered the privy, and over time the story lingered, not because it mocked him cruelly, but because it revealed a truth both humbling and universal. Even kings are, in the end, human. The view from the window. There's something gently tragic about imagining an old man alone, sitting in quiet routine only to be struck down in an instant. We tend to imagine death as a moment of drama, of orchestral chords and final gasps, but it is often simple, silent, and in that simplicity lies something oddly beautiful. Perhaps as he sat that morning, George II looked out the narrow window of his closet and saw the trees turning amber. Perhaps he thought of his youth in Hanover, of long-forgotten arguments, or of nothing at all. And then, like a candle in a breeze, he was gone. Not quite the ending he'd planned. George II was the last British monarch to be buried at Westminster Abbey. His heart, following old tradition, was placed in an urn. And beside him eventually lay Queen Caroline, his beloved, whose tomb he had once ordered designed so that their coffins could rest with a gap between, allowing their bones to mingle in death. A romantic touch, despite a life of royal formality. But the tale of George's demise remained. Passed down through generations, whispered in classrooms, chuckled over in history books. The king who died on the toilet. And though the image is slightly ridiculous, it is also strangely comforting, because it reminds us that even at the height of grandeur, surrounded by silks and marble, mortality remains humbling, inevitable, honest. And as you lay here now, soft under covers, you can smile gently and think, even kings have bad mornings. Tonight, as the world outside quiets, we drift further back in time, past the powdered wigs of Georgian England, beyond the cardamom buns of Sweden, to a medieval castle cloaked in stone and rumor. This is a tale both chilling and absurd, one that blends fire, folly, and a monarch whose final moments were so odd, so uniquely macabre, that they've echoed through history with a kind of surreal disbelief. Tonight, we light a candle for King Charles II of Navarre, also known, with some hesitation, as Charles the Bad. And perhaps by the end of this story you'll agree, bad luck, bad temper, and bad timing are a dangerous mix. A king feared, not loved. Charles II was born in 1332 into a Europe roiling with war, plague, and fractured loyalties. He was the ruler of Navarre, a small kingdom nestled between France and Spain, and a man known more for scheming than ruling. He was called the Bad, not without reason. A gifted manipulator, he played both sides of the 100 Years' War, betraying allies with the ease of a card trick. He poisoned rivals, imprisoned friends, even had his own brother murdered if the rumors are true. He was not a man to be mourned widely. But oh, how he died. The blanket of brandy in his later years, Charles became increasingly unwell. A lifetime of bitterness, indulgence, and perhaps a few vials of mysterious tinctures had taken their toll. By 1387, he was bedridden, frail, and barely clinging to life. His body, they said, had wasted away, though his mind, sharp and suspicious, remained intact. Doctors of the time, with their curious blend of guesswork and superstition, devised a treatment to wrap the king's body in linen soaked in brandy, a spirit believed to invigorate and warm the flesh. It sounds strange now, but in the 14th century, alcohol was medicine. Brandy was a tonic, and heat was healing. And so, one cold January evening, the king was laid gently upon his bed, naked and shriveled. His attendants began their task, drenching a linen sheet in fine, strong brandy, the room filled with its sharp, sweet scent. Then they wrapped him like a mummy in this flammable shroud. Now comes the twist of fate. To seal the treatment, the final edge of the linen needed cutting. One of the servants, weary and fumbling, in the low candlelight, reached for a knife. But it was dull, so instead, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fatigue, he took a candle, a single flame, to burn away the excess thread. The cloth caught instantly. In an instant, King Charles II of Navarre, the schemer, the poisoner, the great political chameleon, burst into flames, fire and silence. The room descended into chaos. Attendants screamed. Some tried to smother the fire with cloaks. Others ran for help. But the brandy had soaked deep, and flames danced quickly across the king's body, turning his deathbed into a pyre. He burned alive, in his own chamber, wrapped in alcohol-soaked linen. It was a death so grotesque, so absurd, that even his enemies were stunned into silence. There was no battle, no final words of regret, no candle-lit vigil, just a man once feared, reduced to ash by a mistake as simple and as fatal as a servant with a flame. The rumors afterward, of course, the story spread like wildfire, quite literally. Chronicles from the time couldn't resist repeating the tale, and over the centuries it only grew in legend. Some said it was divine punishment. Others claimed his own dark arts had turned against him. But historians, ever the realists, pointed to a tragic accident. A king already unpopular, caught in the crossfire of medieval medicine and bad luck. And perhaps it's better that way. For in this death, unlike so many others in Charles's life, there were no plots, no poison, no betrayal, just the pure, unfiltered absurdity of human error, a fitting end to a fickle reign. Strangely, this bizarre death may have suited Charles more than any quiet departure could have. He had lived a life of chaos, manipulated popes, kings, and generals, started wars, switched sides, made enemies from friends and friends from enemies, sometimes in the same week. That he should go out not with grace but in a flare of fiery panic seems almost poetic, almost just. And yet, there is something mournful about it too. Because behind the title, The Bad, there was still a man, one who loved power too much, who mistrusted even his own family, who perhaps feared in his last days not just death, but being forgotten. Now, ironically, he is remembered more vividly than most kings of his time, not for what he ruled or won, but for the strange and terrible way in which he left the world. A flame in the dark as you lie here tonight. Let your mind drift not just to fire and brandy, but to the quiet chamber before the chaos, the faint smell of old wood and wine, the flickering shadows of a single candle, the hush of servants trying not to wake a dying man. It's in that quiet just before the flame that Charles's story pauses, an uneasy breath before the inevitable. He wasn't mourned like other kings. There were no songs, no grand funerals, just silence. And maybe for a man who lived his life like a chess match, that silence was the most fitting legacy of all. Tonight we exchange flaming blankets and royal dining rooms for something even stranger, something that feels almost too small, too everyday, to to belong in the pages of royal history. Tonight we tell the tale of King Alexander of Greece, a young monarch whose reign was short, whose life was tragic, and whose death was, oddly enough, caused not by war, betrayal, or disease, but by a monkey. Yes, a monkey. And no, this isn't a fable, it really happened. So, snuggle in, let the world slow down, and let's gently wander back to Athens, in the early 20th century. A crown by circumstance, Alexander wasn't meant to be. King born in 1893, he was the second son of King Constantine I of Greece. His elder brother, Crown Prince George, stood between him and the throne. And for most of his youth, Alexander expected a life in the background, a prince perhaps, with a villa and a yacht, but no crown. That changed during World War I. Greece, a small but strategic kingdom, was caught in a tug-of-war between the Allies and the Central Powers. King Constantine, sympathetic to Germany, clashed with the Greek government, which favored the Allies. Political pressure mounted. Tensions flared. In 1917, under pressure from the Allies, Constantine was forced to abdicate, not in favor of his eldest son George, who was seen as too pro-German, but in favor of Alexander, the quieter, less controversial, brother. And so, at the age of just 24, Alexander became king, but not truly. A puppet in a palace. Alexander's rule was symbolic. Real power remained with Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos and the Allied-aligned government. The palace, once bustling with royal decisions, became a kind of gilded prison. The young king was lonely. His family had been exiled. He had few allies in court. He passed the days walking the palace gardens, feeding animals, and trying to make peace with the role he never wanted. It was during one of these strolls, peaceful, mundane, harmless, that fate intervened. The Monkey in the Effie. Garden. It was October 1920. The palace grounds in Tatoi, just outside Athens, were lush and expansive. Alexander, as was his custom, walked with his dog. The sun was warm. The trees rustled softly. It was, by all accounts, a beautiful afternoon. Then, from the nearby trees, a monkey appeared. Now it should be noted that Tatoi Palace had several monkeys kept as exotic pets by members of the royal household. They were not dangerous, at least not in theory. Mischievous, yes, but not deadly. But this monkey, belonging to a palace steward, was not in the mood for politeness. It lunged at the king's dog. Alexander, without hesitation, stepped in to protect his pet. He kicked at the monkey, shouted, tried to separate the animals. That's when a second monkey appeared and bit him hard, on the leg and the torso. Servants eventually arrived and chased the animals away, but the damage was done. The wounds, though not enormous, became infected. Medical care at the time, especially in Greece, was far from what it is today. Antibiotics didn't exist yet. The infection spread. In the following days, Alexander developed a raging fever. His legs swelled. His body weakened. He began to hallucinate. 3 weeks later, he was dead. At 27 years old, King Alexander of Greece, wartime monarch, accidental ruler, died from a monkey bite. The ripples of a small bite. The absurdity of his death might make you smile. A king, felled not by army or assassin, but by a monkey. But the consequences were anything but light. Alexander had no heir. His death reopened the succession crisis in Greece. Political chaos followed. His father, Constantine I, returned to the throne, against allied wishes. The monarchy, now weakened, would never fully recover. In fact, many historians argue that Alexander's death triggered a domino effect of instability: the Greco-Turkish War, the fall of the monarchy, and decades of turmoil, all because of a monkey in a garden. A quiet figure in a loud time. What's perhaps most tragic is that Alexander never asked for any of this. He didn't crave power. He didn't plot or scheme. He was a young man placed in a position not by ambition but by geopolitics. And in that role he tried, quietly, earnestly, to do his best. He wrote letters to his exiled family. He walked among the olive trees. He fell in love with a commoner, Aspasia Manos, and married her in secret, defying royal convention. His death, though ridiculous in circumstance, carries the weight of a life lived in the margins of power, a reminder that history often forgets the quiet players until something extraordinary happens. And so we remember Alexander is not a king etched in marble or sung about in national anthems. But tonight we remember him, not for his rule, but for his very human moment of courage, protecting a beloved pet, reacting with instinct, not royal detachment, and paying the ultimate price for it. It is, in a strange and gentle way, a noble death, and as you lie here now, eyes heavy, you can imagine that garden, the dry leaves underfoot, the quiet clicking of branches, the sunlight on the path, a young man alone in the palace of history simply trying to do what felt right, and maybe, just maybe, that's worth remembering. Tonight, as the day folds quietly behind you, we continue our gentle march through the quieter, stranger corridors of royal history. Tonight's tale brings us to the ancient kingdom of Aragon, nestled under the Mediterranean sun, and to a king who died not in battle nor in grief, but from laughter. Yes, tonight's monarch died laughing. There is something deeply human in that. And yet, as you'll hear, it wasn't laughter that killed him directly, but what caused it. So now fluff your pillow, dim the lights, and let us step softly into the 15th century, where a royal joke went just a little too far. King Martin, the last of his line, King Martin Wine of Aragon, sometimes called Martin the Owl, humane, reigned during the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a time of papal rivalries, dynastic crises, and growing tensions across the Iberian Peninsula. He was not a foolish man, nor a cruel one. In fact, he was known for his generosity and his keen interest in the arts and literature. He was also quite devout and cared deeply about the moral fabric of his court. But like many kings of his era, Martin ruled over more than just lands. He ruled over complex family lines, political expectations, and, eventually, a succession problem that would echo long after his death. Still, he was beloved in his court. Humble in some ways, humorous in others. And it was humor, unexpectedly, that would lead to his very undignified end. A heavy dinner, a heavier joke. It was June 1410th. King Martin, by then 53 years old, had recently returned from a long campaign in Sardinia. He was tired, possibly unwell, and like many rulers of the time, his health was a mix of mystery and myth. He had grown bloated in his later years, perhaps from rich food or stress or simple age. One warm evening, he sat down to a particularly heavy dinner. The specifics have been lost to time, but we know this. He ate too much, far too much. And afterward he retired to his chambers, clutching his stomach and complaining of severe indigestion. Now you might remember this from our very first tale. Overindulgence is a quiet theme among monarchs. But Martin's story doesn't end with food. It takes a strange detour into comedy. As the king lay in discomfort, he summoned his court jester, a man named Bora, hoping for distraction. Some lightheartedness, a little foolishness to soothe the stomach, and Bora delivered. Oh, how he delivered. The joke that killed a king. What exactly? The jester said that night has been the subject of centuries of retelling. One version goes like this. When asked where he had been, Bora replied, in the next vineyard watching a young deer hang by its tail from a tree, because it had tried to do what it should do only from the front. The joke, in its medieval crudeness, implied a failed attempt at courtship, let's say. And whether from surprise, absurdity, or just the sheer relief of laughter after a miserable meal, King Martin broke into uncontrollable giggles. He laughed, and then he choked. Whether it was the laughter or the lingering indigestion or a mix of both, his body suddenly failed him. He collapsed, wheezing, pale. By morning he was dead, and so ended the reign of Martin the Humane, the king who died laughing at a joke about a deer's romantic misadventures. A kingdom without an heir. Martin's death didn't just end his life, it ended his dynasty. He left no legitimate heir. His son, Martin the Younger, had died the year before. What followed was 2 years of political uncertainty, a period known as the Interregnum, in which Aragon struggled to choose a new ruler. Eventually, a cousin, Ferdinand of Castile, was chosen. And thus, the stage was set for the eventual unification of Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella. All because a king, one summer evening, laughed just a little too hard. Laughter in the shadows of history. Now you might wonder, how did this story survive? Was it true? Or just a myth spun by chroniclers? Historians tend to agree that Martin did indeed die unexpectedly, and that indigestion played a role. The detail about the jester's joke, though not confirmed in royal medical records, which were hardly thorough, appears in multiple near-contemporary sources. Enough to suggest that the tale, while embellished, has roots in truth, and besides, truth or not, it became his legacy. Not war, not treaties, but a chuckle. The comfort of humor. There's something deeply human about dying with a laugh. For all the pomp and circumstance of royalty, Martin's death is a reminder of how even kings, men raised above others in gold and velvet, are still moved by the simplest of things. A shared joke. A moment of absurdity. A silly mental image that tickles just right. As you settle further into rest, think of King Martin. Imagine the warm night air drifting in through the palace shutters, the flicker of torchlight on stone walls, a jester, half bowing, grinning with mischief, a king, tired and bloated, suddenly bright with laughter, then a pause, then silence, and the strange, gentle irony of a man known as the Humane, leaving the world not with a sword, but with a snort. A final chuckle. Not every royal death is wrapped in tragedy. Some, like Martin's, are tinged with the comic, the improbable, the almost endearing. They remind us that even those draped in ermine and crowned with jewels are subject to the whims of body and breath, and, apparently, of jesters. So as your thoughts drift tonight, if a soft smile plays on your lips, let it. For laughter, when it comes honestly, is a gift, even when it surprises us, especially when it surprises us. If you're resting now with eyes half closed and blankets drawn tight, imagine the echoing halls of a Renaissance palace, where walls are covered in tapestries and polished marble floors stretch long into candlelit distance. This was the world of King Charles VIII of France, a ruler who dreamed of conquering kingdoms only to be conquered by a doorframe. Yes, a doorframe. Tonight's tale is about ambition that overreached, heads that didn't duck low enough, and how even kings, in their finest armor, can fall victim to the most mundane obstacle of all: bad architecture. The boy king. With big ideas, Charles VIII was never meant to be an adventurer. He ascended the throne in 1483 at just 13 years old, following the death of his father, Louis XV. France at the time was a patchwork kingdom, more fragile alliance than unified. Date. Charles's early years were controlled by his sister, Anne of France, and her husband. He was sheltered, frail, awkward even. But as he grew older, Charles became enamored with tales of ancient Rome and the glittering courts of Italy. He dreamed of conquest, of glory, of becoming a modern-day Caesar. In 1494, he launched the Italian War, marching with a grand army across the Alps to claim the kingdom of Naples, which he believed was his by right. It was a disastrous and expensive adventure, but it lit the fuse for over half a century of conflict across Europe. Charles had made his mark, however fleetingly, and then, just as he returned to France, flushed with a strange mixture of pride and debt, he hit a door, a game, a courtyard. A fatal bump. It was a mild spring afternoon in 1498, in the Château d'Amboise, a beautiful Loire Valley palace with sweeping staircases, turrets, and views of the sparkling river. The king, now 27 years old, was walking through the castle grounds to watch a game of jeu de paume, an ancestor of modern tennis. The game was popular among the nobility, involving bouncing balls off walls in echoing indoor courts. It was loud, sweaty, and surprisingly, brutal. Charles, accompanied by his queen and several courtiers, was in high spirits, perhaps too high. As they passed under a low lintel, a stone doorway connecting the inner chambers with the courtyard, the king, distracted and chattering, failed to duck. He struck his head hard against the lintel. Witnesses later said he staggered, then laughed it off. Others claim he paused, rubbed his scalp, and joked about how even kings must bow. But the damage was done. He collapsed hours later, struck by what we now suspect was a brain hemorrhage caused by the blow. He never regained consciousness, and so in a palace built to his glory, wearing the silk robes of victory, Charles VIII died of walking into a door. An unheroic end for an ambitious king. Charles's death was met with shock. He had no surviving sons, only a daughter, whom Salic law barred from inheriting. His cousin, Louis of Orleans, became King Louis XIII, and with him, the line of Valois kings drew to a close. What stung, perhaps more than the political consequences, was the sheer lack of drama in Charles's death. He hadn't died in battle, nor by betrayal, nor even of illness. He died from a head bump, a royal bonk. It's the kind of detail that history struggles to make dignified. Chroniclers did their best. They tried to frame the death as sudden or divinely timed. But the facts were hard to dress up. One minute he was alive, the next, felled by a chunk of stone he hadn't noticed. In modern times, it's the kind of moment that might be replayed endlessly on social media. A royal blooper, a viral stumble. In 1498, it became an uncomfortable punchline whispered behind velvet curtains, a cautionary tale of haste and headroom. There's a certain poetic irony in Charles's end. He had launched one of Europe's first modern wars, crossing mountains with artillery, challenging popes and princes. He had dreamed of imperial crowns and Mediterranean ports. But in the end, it wasn't war or ambition that claimed him. It was a ceiling. And perhaps that's why the story lingers. Not just for its absurdity, but because it feels so terribly human. We all know the pain of a bumped head. That flash of stars, the awkward laughter, the disbelief. Now imagine that sensation, and then darkness. That a king with armies and architects at his command could be undone by forgetting to duck is humbling in the truest sense. The sound of stone and silence. As you lie here now, warm and still, picture that afternoon in Amboise. The sound of tennis balls echoing across courtyards, the rustle of silk robes, birds darting across blue sky, and somewhere just off to the side, a group of courtiers pausing as the king stumbles, blinking and murmuring, "Oh, that was a bit low." And then, the silence. The kind of silence that descends when no one quite knows what to say, when tragedy wears the costume of comedy, and grief comes wrapped in absurdity. And so we remember. Charles VIII isn't remembered as a great king, nor a cruel one. He was impulsive, romantic, driven by visions rather than strategies. But he reminds us that even kings don't get to choose their endings. Some fall on battlefields, others on bathroom floors, and some, like Charles, pass through history's door, a little too quickly, and with their heads held just a little too high. As the candle of history flickers softly tonight, casting warm light on the peculiar corners of the past, we return to a time steeped in togas, scrolls, and sandals, the ancient Roman world. But this isn't a tale of Caesar or Augustus. No. Our story tonight belongs to a lesser-known monarch, King Herod Agrippa I, ruler of Judea under the shadow of Rome. His death is recorded in dramatic, even supernatural terms. It involved robes made of silver, an audience hungry for flattery, and, well, an unfortunate issue with worms and a most private form of punishment. So lie back, let the day fade, and join me in the sunlit colonnades of Caesarea, where a king once glowed like a god until the glow turned inward. The silver robe of hubris Herod Agrippa. I was a shrewd political figure, grandson of Herod the Great and a friend of Emperor Caligula, and later Claudius. Agrippa knew how to survive in the perilous tides of Roman politics. He was well-spoken, charming, and had the rare talent of being popular among both his Roman Overlords and his Jewish subjects, no small feat at the time. By all accounts, he enjoyed public admiration. And one day in 44 CE, he decided to lean into that admiration a little too hard. He appeared in Caesarea Maritima, a glittering seaside city founded by his grandfather, for a public address. The event was held in the grand amphitheater, with local dignitaries, Roman officials, and curious citizens all gathered under the Mediterranean sun. Agrippa chose a particularly dazzling outfit, a robe woven entirely of silver thread. When he stepped into the morning light, the metal caught the sun and shone so brightly that witnesses said he blazed like the sun. A voice from the crowd shouted, "This is not the voice of a man, but of a god." And Agrippa, rather than humbly denying the comparison, said nothing. He accepted the praise, and then things took a turn. Struck from within. According to the historian Josephus, no sooner had Agrippa absorbed the applause than he was seized by sudden abdominal pain. He collapsed mid-speech, clutching his stomach. Accounts say he was immediately moved to his palace, where he lingered in agony for 5 days. And what caused the pain? Worms. To be precise, intestinal parasites, likely a severe case of gangrenous peritonitis or possibly a ruptured cyst. The sources, of course, couldn't offer medical detail, but the imagery was dramatic. The king, dressed in silver like a deity, now lying doubled over, groaning, his body rotting from the inside out. And if the historians are to be believed, the infestation focused on one very specific part of his anatomy, his genitals. Yes, ancient writers like Josephus and later Christian chroniclers were uncomfortably clear on this point. The punishment, they claimed, was divine, and targeted his private parts for his vanity. A theatrical death. The story reads like a cautionary play. Hubris punished not with thunderbolts or poison, but with humiliation. A king rising like a god in metallic splendor, only to be unmade by parasites gnawing at his most vulnerable self. There's something oddly theatrical about it, as if the universe had chosen the most awkward and unforgettable exit possible. 5 days he suffered, they say. 5 days of swelling, fever, and a very undignified smell. He was only 54 years old. And when he died, the same people who once shouted, "God!" now whispered in disgust, shaking their heads and speaking of pride and punishment. Divine justice or digestive tragedy? Historians today take a more grounded view. Herod Agrippa likely died of infectious disease, perhaps a parasitic infection like ascariasis, or a ruptured appendix leading to sepsis. In ancient times, poor sanitation made such fates tragically common, even among kings. The specific mention of his genitals being the focus of decay might be a literary invention, an exaggeration to make a moral point. Writers in antiquity often aimed not just to record but to warn. Still, the story stuck, because in the end there's something unmistakably human about it. A man who wanted to be seen as more than he was, brought down not by his enemies, but by his own insides. The king who glowed, then groaned. There's a strange softness in imagining that moment. Agrippa, standing tall in his silver robe, basking in applause, the Mediterranean breeze ruffling the hem of his garment. Then, slowly, a hand on his stomach, a wince, a sudden tremble, and then silence. The silver no longer glinting, the light gone. The god turned back to flesh, and beneath the marble colonnades of Caesarea, a lesson, quiet but unforgettable, settled into the stone. A caution with a comedic edge. Even now, long after the worms have had their day, Agrippa's tale feels like something out of dark comedy. He didn't fall in battle. He didn't succumb to betrayal. He wasn't murdered. He overdid the sparkle. He let the crowd's praise rise too high. And then, the universe answered with an itchy, uncomfortable, unforgettable no. Sleep, softly humbled. So as you settle further into comfort tonight, remember Agrippa not with mockery, but with a soft, knowing smile. Because pride comes in many forms, and sometimes when the spotlight grows too bright, it's the worms who get the final word. Tonight we travel to Bohemia, a medieval kingdom veiled in forest mist, stone castles, and centuries of blood-stained crowns. But our story is not of epic battles or sacred relics. No. This tale is whispered with awkward glances, quiet snickers, and a wince of second-hand embarrassment. Because the death of Wenceslaus III, King of Bohemia, Hungary, and briefly Poland, didn't come from sword or spear. It came from a toilet. Yes, once again we find royalty betrayed not by politics but by plumbing, or in this case the medieval version of it. So fluff your pillow, let the hush of night settle over you, and follow me into a tale of youthful ambition. Royal enemies and a fatal fall that no bard dared rhyme. A young king on the rise, Wenceslaus III was born in 1289 into the powerful Přemyslid dynasty of Bohemia. His father, King Wenceslaus II, was a master of dynastic chess, marrying his children into royal lines across Central Europe and securing crowns from Prague to Krakow. When Wenceslaus II died in 1305, young Wenceslaus III, just 16 years old, became King of Bohemia and Poland. He had already been crowned King of Hungary, although his claim there was shaky at best. Still, 3 crowns before your 18th birthday? Not bad. But with so much power came enemies. Nobles in Poland resented Bohemian rule. Hungarian factions conspired. Even within his own court, whispers of betrayal stirred, and Wenceslaus, ambitious but still green, tried to hold it all together. A journey to war in August 1306, Wenceslaus marched east toward Poland, planning to crush dissent and secure his throne once and for all. He stopped in the city of Olomouc, in modern-day Moravia, now the Czech Republic, and took up residence in a local bishop's palace, a stately place with Romanesque arches, quiet, gardens, and a rather unfortunate privy built into the outer wall. This medieval latrine was typical of the time. A stone seat set high above a pit or stream, with waste falling through an opening in the floor to the ground below. Often these chambers were built into the exterior of castle walls to keep the smell and mess outside. It was there, in this narrow, drafty chamber, that Wenceslaus III made his final appearance. A fall too far. The exact details are murky, lost in the shadows of medieval rumor and hasty chronicles. Some say he was assassinated while seated on the toilet, a dagger slipping between the gaps of the wooden seat. Others suggest he was pushed from behind, the fall from the high latrine chamber breaking his neck or impaling him on the jagged rocks below. A few versions even claim he slipped, perhaps distracted or unwell, and tumbled from the seat to the courtyard beneath. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Wenceslaus III died in or near a toilet, alone, unarmed, and very much off guard. He was just 17, and with his death, the Přemyslid dynasty, the oldest ruling house in Bohemia, came to a sudden and undignified end. A throne, lost by a seat, the symbolism was not lost on his enemies. Here was a king who had sat on 3 royal thrones, undone by the humblest of seats. The contrast between royal ambition and latrine misfortune was too sharp to ignore. Wenceslaus III's death threw the region into chaos. Rival claimants emerged. Hungary and Poland slipped from Bohemian control. Civil war simmered, and yet in all the turmoil, chroniclers paused to note the oddness of it all. That the last king of one of Europe's oldest dynasties had died not in glory but in a lavatory. From majesty to mortality, medieval chroniclers had a difficult time writing about this without blushing, it seems. Some accounts are brief, even vague, as if the scribes were embarrassed on the king's behalf. Others, especially from rival lands, leaned into the details. One Polish version describes his dishonorable fall as punishment for trying to claim lands that weren't his. A German source hints that his killer was one who waited until the king was vulnerable, which, if true, paints a dark and intimate picture of betrayal. And yet, in every version, it is the toilet that lingers. The seat. The fall. The place no monarch wants to be remembered. A quiet, cracked legacy Wenceslaus III left behind no children. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the extinction of a dynasty. It was a quiet, ignoble conclusion to a house that had once shaped the heart of Europe. But strangely, perhaps poetically, that's precisely why we remember him. He was a boy king caught in the storm of adult ambition, a young man with too many titles and not enough time. And his ending, tragic, absurd, humiliating, is a reminder that history does not care for dignity. It cares for stories. And this one, despite its awkwardness, has remained. As you drift off tonight, as you nestle deeper into warmth and silence, imagine the high halls of Olomouc. The candlelight flickering on stone, the muffled murmurs of advisors, the hush before betrayal, and in a narrow chamber above a courtyard, a young king alone with his thoughts, unaware that history is already writing his final footnote. Sometimes, the most powerful stories are not those of triumph, but of fragility, and sometimes thrones are lost not in battle but in the bathroom. Tonight we find ourselves back in medieval France, a land of courtly love, brocaded cloaks, and wine-heavy revelry. It was a time when nobles danced beneath crystal chandeliers and kings wore embroidered madness like a second crown. But the story we tell tonight is not about King Charles VI, the troubled monarch whose mind so often wandered into fantasy. No, tonight's tale belongs to Louis I, Duke of Orléans, his flamboyant brother. And though technically not a crowned king, Louis was as close to royal power as one could get without actually wearing the crown. And his death? Oh, his death was the result of too much fun colliding with too much flammable fabric, because sometimes a party really can get out of hand, and sometimes torches should not be mixed with costumes made of tar, resin, and feathers. A mad court and a mad idea. It was January 1393, during the depths of a cold Parisian winter, when the court gathered for a masquerade ball unlike any other. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria had organized the festivities to celebrate the third marriage of one of her ladies-in-waiting. In medieval custom, such weddings were occasions of great pomp, dancing, food, jesters, music, and sometimes strange performances. Someone, perhaps emboldened by wine, proposed a wild men dance. Now, wild men, or woodwoses, were figures from European folklore, half-human, covered in hair, feral, and untamed. They symbolized the dangerous edge of the forest, the animal within man. A group of courtiers, including the Duke of Orléans and the king himself, agreed to dress as these creatures, head to toe in flax, pitch, resin, and feathers, all adhered with sticky, flammable materials. The idea was to jump around, dance, and howl like beasts, causing laughter and delight. No one expected it would end in screaming. The Bal des Ardents, the dance of the burning ones. The performers were led into the ballroom by torchlight. How else could one dance without modern electricity? They danced, they roared, they leapt like animals circling the firelight, their makeshift fur catching the warm glow. And then, a torch was dropped. Accounts vary on who was to blame. Some say it was the king's brother Louis who accidentally brought the flame too close. Others blame an onlooker who tried to get a closer look, tipping his torch forward with curiosity. But regardless of who dropped it, the result was the same. One of the dancers caught fire, then another. The resin and flax ignited like dry tinder, turning the men into human torches in seconds. The crowd screamed, chaos erupted, and Louis, Duke of Orléans, drunk, joyous, now ablaze, ran through the ballroom, feathers melting, resin cracking, cries echoing through stone. 4 of the dancers died horribly. The king, by sheer luck, survived, having been shielded by a quick-thinking noblewoman who threw her skirts over his costume and smothered the flames. But Louis was not so fortunate. He died days later from burns so severe that even the hardened physicians of the court turned away. A court in shame. The aftermath was devastating, not just in grief, but in embarrassment. This was no battlefield. This was a party. And yet, the heir to France's political elite had perished like a carnival accident, felled by flammable fluff and poor planning. The court fell into mourning, but also into murmurs. People whispered about curses, divine punishment, royal madness. Some said it was a sign from God, retribution for decadence. Others simply called it foolishness of the highest order. And the name of the event, once meant to be festive, was renamed forever as Le Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. A turning point in madness. Interestingly, the tragedy may have tipped the mental health of Charles VI, already fragile, into deeper instability. He began suffering more frequent episodes of delusion, sometimes believing he was made of glass or forgetting who he was entirely. Whether trauma from witnessing the fire played a role, we'll never truly know. But the incident left a scar, not only on the royal court but on French culture itself. Paintings, poems, and even sermons reference the event for generations as a symbol of how royal folly leads to ruin. The irony of innocence. Louis there wasn't known as cruel. He was flamboyant, certainly, fond of color, women, and wit. He loved the theater of power more than its burden. Some contemporaries described him as too fond of merriment. And yet, that very merriment became his undoing. He didn't die plotting rebellion. He didn't die in a duel, or from poison, or in exile. He died because someone thought it would be funny to dress like a caveman and leap around a fire in a suit made of tar and twigs. It's almost Shakespearean, tragedy emerging from comedy. Let the music fade as you settle now into the rhythm of your breath. Picture the ballroom, once vibrant, now quiet, the air thick with smoke. The music stopped, candles flickering nervously, a dancer's mask half melted lying forgotten on the floor. And through the broken laughter, the echo of a life that ended not in shame, but in mischief misunderstood. And still, we dance tonight. As you drift toward sleep, let this tale serve not just as caution, but as strange comfort. Even in the high courts of kings, surrounded by jewels and titles, humans remain humans, prone to mischief, drawn to fire, and occasionally, spectacularly, undone by it. Sleep softly, and maybe keep the torches a little farther from the feathers. Tonight, as the world hushes itself into stillness, we open a quieter chapter in the annals of royal exits. This is not a tale of flaming feathers or dancing kings. No, this story is wrapped in parchment, bound in leather, and tinged with the scent of ink. It's the story of Al-Mustasim, the last caliph of Baghdad, once the most powerful man in the Islamic world, whose death came not by sword, not by poison, not even by execution in the way one might expect, but by books, a library to be precise, and the crushing weight of all he did not read. So lean back, take a deep breath, and let us travel back to 1258, on the banks of the Tigris River, where the golden age of a once mighty empire met an ending, most unceremonious. The Caliphate of Paper and Power Al-Mustasim was the 37th Abbasid Caliph, ruler of the Islamic Caliphate headquartered in Baghdad, a city that, for centuries, had been the intellectual and cultural heart of the Muslim world. Baghdad, in its prime, was a beacon of knowledge, home to the House of Wisdom, a sprawling complex where scholars translated ancient Greek texts, mapped the stars, and debated philosophy beneath lantern-lit domes. The city's libraries were legendary. Some claimed they held more books than all of Europe combined, pages of poetry, astronomy, medicine, engineering, treasures bound in leather, stored on floor-to-ceiling shelves. But by the mid-13th century, the world was changing, and from the east came a storm. Enter the Mongols in 1258. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, approached Baghdad with a vast army. The Mongols, unstoppable and ruthless, had already laid waste to Persia and Central Asia. Hulagu sent word to the caliph, surrender or face ruin. Al-Mustasim, perhaps overconfident in divine favor or the city's ancient prestige, refused. He believed Baghdad could not fall. He was wrong. The Mongols breached the walls. For days the city burned. Tens of thousands perished. The streets ran red. The libraries, the House of Wisdom itself, were destroyed. Legend says that so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink. And the caliph, he was taken prisoner. a death too undignified to be true. Now, how al-Mustasim died has been a subject of historical debate. But the most widely repeated version is this. The Mongols, believing it was bad luck to shed royal blood, sought a creative solution. They wrapped the caliph in a carpet, and then they beat him to death with books. Yes, books. Some versions say the very tomes he once ignored, thrown at him until his bones cracked and breath ceased. Others say he was trampled by horses while rolled inside the carpet, his execution symbolic. Knowledge and might, crushing arrogance and folly. But the book version persisted, and perhaps it lingered not because it was factually precise, but because it was poetically satisfying. The man who had ruled over a city of learning, who had neglected to fortify it, who had refused advice and failed diplomacy, killed by the very symbol of what he failed to protect. Knowledge. The irony that echoed this image, death by book, is irresistible to historians and storytellers alike. It doesn't just mock a failed ruler, it warns. It says, beware those who treat knowledge lightly. It says, empires are not only conquered by armies, but by ignorance. And while scholars debate whether books were truly used as blunt instruments or merely symbolic reference, the message stands. When wisdom is ignored, it can become a weapon. The river of ink and ashes Baghdad burned. Mongol soldiers threw manuscripts into the river by the cartload. Pages floated like petals. Scrolls disintegrated in the water. The Tigris, once a cradle of culture, became a grave. And somewhere along its banks, a rolled-up carpet was laid still. Inside, the final caliph of Baghdad, not martyred, not remembered in glory, but quietly, tragically, crushed beneath the weight of a world he did not understand. An ending in paper, not stone. There's something strangely soft about this story. It lacks the brutality of other royal deaths. There's no gore, no drama, just the quiet sound of paper, on flesh like leaves falling too fast. But within that softness lies a thunderous truth, that the empires we build, not just of stone and soldiers, but of knowledge and art, can crumble not from the outside, but from within. From inattention, from pride, from thinking a library can protect you when you've never once opened a book inside it. As you drift downstream tonight, as you drift gently toward sleep, imagine the silent halls of the House of Wisdom, the scent of old parchment, the scratch of quills on papyrus, the soft flutter of pages turned by candlelight, and then the silence, the kind that comes when knowledge is no longer sought, the kind that weighs heavier than stone. May it be a reminder, not just of history, but of humility, because in the end, whether crowned or not, we are all shaped by what we choose to learn or ignore. Tonight's tale takes us far back, to the misty edges of early English history, where swords clanged in shield walls, kings ruled with heavy brows, and life was short, brutish, and oddly, sometimes comic. Our subject is King Edmund Ironside. His epithet may sound heroic. Ironside evokes images of a warrior king, tough and unyielding, but his death, though whispered through centuries, reads like a cautionary joke whispered around a medieval fire. Because while Edmund may have lived, like a lion, he died like, well, someone who should have checked his toilet. Yes, friends, this is the story of a king brought low not by blade or betrayal, but by what waited for him on his latrine seat. The warrior king of a shattered kingdom, Edmund II, known as Ironside, for his incredible resilience in battle, ruled England for just 7 months in 1016, a turbulent time when the island was torn between Saxon rule and Danish invaders. His father, King Ethelred the Unready, had left the kingdom in disarray. The Danes under King Nut, yes, that Nut, were pushing hard from the north. Edmund stood against them bravely, leading army after army, earning his nickname by sheer endurance. He won some battles, lost others, and finally came to a fragile peace with Nut, dividing the kingdom between them. But before Edmund could enjoy the fruit of his hard-fought truce, nature, or something more sinister, called. A visit to the Privy on November 30th, 1016, just weeks after the peace, Edmund reportedly excused himself from court. He entered the royal latrine alone, likely a raised wooden seat over a stone shaft, as was common in noble homes of the time. A place not of comfort, but of necessary solitude. What happened next has been whispered with increasing incredulity for over 1,000 years. According to chroniclers, a hidden assassin lay in wait beneath the privy, wedged into the pit of this latrine, armed with a dagger or short spear, and waiting patiently in the darkness. As Edmund sat down, the assassin struck upward. And that, according to legend, was how the King of England died. Stabbed from below, on the toilet, by someone who had been lurking, quite literally, in the filth. Assassination or absurdity? Now, modern historians debate the accuracy of this tale. Some suggest it was Danish propaganda, a myth created to humiliate the memory of a powerful Saxon opponent. Others propose that it was a later fabrication, meant to highlight the ruthlessness of King Nut, or the treachery of those around Edmund. But the story persists. It appears in 12th century histories, repeated with uncomfortable detail. And what makes it linger isn't just the oddity of it, but the symbolism. A mighty warrior, a man who faced swords, arrows, ambushes, and survived. And yet, undone not in war, but in his most vulnerable, solitary moment. It's tragic, and strangely, funny. The unseen enemy, if the tale is true, or even partly true, it speaks volumes about the lengths to which Edmund's enemies would go. To place an assassin in a pit of waste, hidden for hours, possibly days, requires both determination and utter disregard for dignity. But perhaps that was the point. To kill a king in such a way was not merely assassination, it was humiliation. And in the rough politics of the 11th century, image mattered. A warrior who dies in battle becomes a legend. A warrior who dies on the toilet becomes a warning. The throne below the throne. And so, Edmund Ironside became the rare monarch to have died on two thrones. One symbolic, the other, all too literal. He was buried with full honors, his body laid in Glastonbury Abbey. And over time, his memory as a fierce defender of England was largely restored. But the whisper of his unusual demise never quite faded. Monks recorded it with veiled language. Bards skipped it in song. But the tale lived on in the margins of history, too strange to be true, too specific to be dismissed. A caution for kings and everyone else. There's something darkly comforting in Edmund's tale, not because he died in humiliation, but because he died as all mortals do, in the middle of something mundane. For all his might and courage, he could not outwit what waited beneath the wooden seat. And in that, there's a humbling reminder that the grand stage of power often ends in the most human of places, and that perhaps is the real lesson. As night settles softly, as you rest tonight, imagine a stormy November evening in medieval England, the chill of stone halls, the smell of smoke and thatched roofs, the sound of wind through bare trees, and in a quiet chamber at the back of a royal hall a door creaks open. A king enters, seeking a moment of peace, and beneath him, the most unexpected of endings waits. Not all kings fall in battle. Some, like Edmund Ironside, meet history in silence, in shadows, and underfoot. As the world hushes under moonlight and your breath softens into a rhythm of rest, we drift gently toward Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. Marble colonnades shimmer in candlelight. Church domes rise like bubbles into the night sky. And at the heart of this imperial dream, Basil I, or Emperor of the Romans. Born a peasant, Basil rose to rule one of the greatest empires in the known world. A story of cunning, ambition, and yes, a surprising amount of horse riding. But his reign, grand, complex, riddled with palace plots. ended not with a whisper or a war cry, but with an animal accident of truly memorable design. Tonight we discover how the man who once ruled the East Roman Empire met his end not by sword or sickness, but by mule. From stable to throne, Basil's beginnings were humble, almost folkloric. Born around 811 CE in what is now Macedonia, he was likely the son of peasants, or possibly Armenian migrants. Accounts differ, as history often does when peasants become emperors. He worked with horses in the imperial stables, eventually catching the eye of nobility with his strength, charm, and surprising intellect. Over the years, Basil climbed fast. He befriended Emperor Michael III, married into the imperial family, and in a plot as bloody as it was efficient, murdered the emperor in his sleep and took the throne for himself. Ruthless? Yes, but also effective. Basil I, once a stable boy, was now emperor of Byzantium, and to his credit, he was a decent one. He reformed the law, stabilized the economy, and founded the Macedonian dynasty, which would rule for over a century. But his death, was less polished. The imperial hunt in 886 CE, Basil was well into his 70s but still fond of the great Byzantine pastime, hunting. The emperor enjoyed the chase, the trumpets, the pageantry. His hunts were not mere sport. They were imperial theater designed to show vitality, power, and divine favor. One day, near the city of Nicomedia, he set out on such a hunt. The air was dry, the sun gentle. His courtiers rode behind him. And Basil, rather than riding a fine war horse or a stately palfrey, chose, curiously, a mule. Why a mule? Perhaps he felt it more stable, more comfortable for his aging joints. Unfortunately, the mule had other ideas. The mule and the cloak, the details, vary slightly between sources, but the essence is this. As Basil rode, his cloak slipped, a richly embroidered imperial garment heavy with gold thread and dyed in precious purple. It dangled down, trailing dangerously near the beast's legs. Perhaps it tickled, perhaps it spooked, but the mule panicked. It reared, it spun, and then it bolted, straight toward a set of stone stairs near a ravine. In a tangle of bridle, cloak, and hooves, the emperor was thrown, or rather, dragged. For several painful minutes, Basil was pulled along the rocky ground by his own terrified mule, cloak twisted, limbs flailing. He hit steps, stones, possibly even a tree or two. When the mule finally stopped, panting, trembling, the once mighty emperor lay bloodied, broken, and unconscious. He died shortly thereafter, succumbing to internal injuries. Thus ended the reign of Basil I, emperor by murder, reformer by law, undone by a mule and his wardrobe, a cloak of too much grandeur. There's something almost Greek tragic about Basil's end. He rose from obscurity on the back of his horse-handling skills, only to be betrayed by a simple riding mishap. He died wrapped in symbols of power, the imperial cloak, the animal beneath him, the very regalia that once elevated him. And yet the mule did not care. The stairs did not yield. And power, as it turns out, can't stop gravity. Imperial embarrassment, one might imagine Byzantine courtiers trying, desperately, to make Basil's death sound more dignified. He passed during a noble hunt, they might say. He was taken by sudden illness while communing with nature. But too many witnesses saw the truth. An emperor flung about like a sack of onions. And worse still, his son, Leo VI, was rumored to have hated him, possibly even arranged the hunt's dangerous route. Though never proven, the whispers added a layer of familial discomfort to the already awkward demise, the legacy of a slippery ride. Despite the strange ending, Basil left a strong legacy. His dynasty would oversee a golden age of Byzantine art, culture, and territorial stability. But the moment of his death lingers because it's so deeply human, not political, not epic, just unlucky. A loose cloak, a startled mule, a tumble down some steps, and a crown that didn't catch him on the way down. As you settle softly, as sleep begins to settle around you, Picture a warm hill outside Nicomedia, the sun low, the sound of distant hunting horns, and a man who once ruled the Eastern Roman world clutching his saddle, unaware that his purple cloak, flapping in the wind, had a different journey in mind. There are kings who fall by treason, and there are kings, like Basil, who simply fall and are never quite caught. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the quiet begins to settle in your room like a soft fog, let us travel to the German-Italian Empire of the 13th century, a realm that straddled Gothic cathedrals, sun-warmed vineyards, and the solemn rituals of Roman rule. It is the time of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. Frederick was a ruler of contradictions, scholar and warrior, patron of science and scourge of the papacy. He spoke 6 languages, kept lions in his court, and tried to prove that chickens could hatch without hearing their mother's cluck. Yes, really. He was a man of enormous intellect, ego, and, as we'll see, unfortunate timing. Because despite his grandeur, his final moment was so banal, so undignified, so utterly domestic, that it slipped through the marble cracks of memory with barely a chisel mark. Frederick II died on the toilet, or so it's told. The philosopher-emperor. Frederick ruled not only the Holy Roman Empire but also Sicily and large parts of Italy. He was crowned in 1220 and immediately set about reshaping his vast, unwieldy kingdom. He was a deeply curious man. He sponsored translations of Arabic medical texts, protected Jewish scholars, and held court with poets, scientists, and mathematicians. His court in Palermo was said to be the most intellectually vibrant in Europe, but he was also a thorn in the side of the church. Frederick was excommunicated multiple times for asserting imperial control over papal lands, and his long feud with Pope Gregory IX became legendary. To his allies, he was a philosopher king. To his enemies, he was the Antichrist in imperial robes, which is why, when he died in 1250, the manner of his death became complicated. The end of a wonder Frederick was in the town of Fiorentino, southern Italy, when he fell ill with dysentery, a common and dangerous affliction in the medieval world. By most accounts, his health had been declining for some time. He grew weak, gaunt. His physicians, alarmed, could do little. And then, one morning, he excused himself to relieve his stomach. The exact spot, a wooden commode in his chamber, and there, amidst the sighs of servants and the muffled sound of water, he died, quietly, alone, on the throne. The other kind, a royal panic. His death created a scramble among courtiers. There was panic, not only over succession, but over how to phrase the moment in the official records. Because you see, this wasn't just a man. This was the Holy Roman Emperor, the world's wonder. And yet, there he lay, pants reportedly around his ankles, slumped forward, imperial seal nearby. It was not dignified. So, the records were cleaned up. Literally and figuratively, he was said to have died in prayer, or in quiet contemplation. Some claimed a sudden seizure. Others cited divine judgment. But the whisper persisted. He died on the toilet. And like all whispers, it outlasted the stone. Too human for history. There's a reason this detail stuck. It is not because people enjoyed mocking Frederick, many admired him even centuries later, but because this ending stripped away the theatricality of monarchy and revealed something almost too human. He wasn't slain in battle. He wasn't murdered. He wasn't enshrined in a blaze of last words and candlelight. He just sat down and didn't get up. There's something tragic in that, and also strangely relatable. The irony of immortality, Frederick II was obsessed with eternity. He saw himself as a Caesar reborn, a philosopher destined to guide Europe into a new age of enlightened monarchy. He studied the stars. He asked impossible questions. And yet, his final moment was as grounded, literally, as it gets. His funeral was grand, of course. He was interred in Palermo Cathedral in a sarcophagus of red porphyry, a stone once reserved for Roman emperors. Priests chanted, nobles wept, the church frowned, but none of it could fully erase the whispered detail that the wonder of the world had met the world's most ordinary end. A throne is still a seat as you drift further into calm. Let yourself imagine the warm stone walls of a southern Italian fortress. A breeze through narrow windows, the hush of early morning, and behind a carved wooden door, a man of great knowledge, great ambition, quietly fading. A crown nearby, a world slipping away, and no one quite sure how to write it down. A lesson in letting go Frederick's story reminds us that even the most brilliant minds cannot script their ending. That power, intellect, and glory, all, are subject to the mundane, the bodily, the humbling. And maybe that's the gift of stories like this. To smile, gently, and to remember that every throne, no matter how grand, is still a place to sit. Tonight we leave the castles and cloaks behind and step into the age of wigs, powdered faces, and revolution. This is the story of Louis XVIII, the last king of France, before the guillotine became the most infamous invention in European politics. He was a monarch born into a world of marble salons and diamond-studded buckles, but died under gray January skies, facing a wooden platform, a sharp blade, and a crowd not quite sure whether to cheer or tremble. It's a death that history has judged harshly, and yet within its quiet absurdities lies something very human. This is not just the fall of a king. It is the story of a man waiting his turn in line, and famously, apologizing to the executioner for stepping on his foot. Yes, that happened. A reluctant King Louis XVIII was never meant to be revolutionary. Born in 1754, he was shy, intelligent in a bookish way, and more interested in locksmithing and hunting than ruling. When he became king in 1774, France was already teetering, financially bankrupt, socially fractured, and filled with Enlightenment thinkers asking dangerous questions. Louis didn't act quickly. He didn't act harshly. He acted politely, and in an age of storms, politeness was not enough. When revolution came, it came fast. The Bastille fell. Bread prices soared. The people shouted for liberty, equality, fraternity, and someone to blame. They looked up, and there was Louis. From palace to prison, the king and his wife Marie Antoinette tried to adapt. They donned tricolor pins. They gave speeches. They smiled carefully, but suspicion grew. Then panic. Then fury. In 1791, they attempted to flee Paris disguised as servants, a plan so poorly executed that it might have passed as a comedy of manners. They were caught, returned, and now no longer monarchs but prisoners. The year that followed was a slow unraveling. The monarchy was abolished, a republic declared, and in January 1793, the National Convention voted to execute the former king. The vote passed by a margin so thin, just one single vote, that it felt like fate holding a razor's edge. And then came the guillotine. The king and the platform. It was a cold morning on January 21st, 1793. Louis, now simply Citizen Capet, was awakened early. He dressed carefully, a white shirt, black breeches, and gray stockings. He asked for a haircut. He prayed. Then he was placed in a cart, surrounded by drummers and soldiers, and paraded through silent streets to the Place de la Révolution. Thousands lined the square. The guillotine, freshly oiled, stood ready, but there was no grand resistance, no speech from a balcony, just a man climbing steps. And then, in what may be the most memorably awkward royal moment ever recorded, Louis turned to Sanson, the chief executioner, and said, "Monsieur, I ask your pardon, I did not do it on purpose," after stepping on the man's foot. Yes, a king, a condemned man, apologizing for a footstep. If ever there was a summary of Louis XVI's entire reign, that was it. Polite, out of step, tragically courteous, even in the face of death. The final words in silence. Louis tried to speak to the crowd. Some accounts say he shouted, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge," but the drummers were ordered to drown him out. And then, in moments, head placed in the lunette, blade dropped. The king, once absolute monarch of the largest kingdom in Europe, was no more. The crowd, stunned, didn't cheer immediately. There was an eerie silence. Then, slowly, a few cries of "Vive la République," but many just stared. The monarchy, with all its powdered grandeur and divine right, had been ended not with thunder, but with a whisper and an apology, the guillotine and the guilt. The guillotine was designed to be humane, efficient, and equalizing. It was nicknamed the National Razor. But for all its rational purpose, it became a symbol of cold bureaucracy in the face of humanity. And Louis's death, so unceremonious, so clean, so oddly civil, only amplified the horror. He had been no tyrant, no butcher, just a man unable to manage the tides of change, and now, just another victim of history's blade. Legacy in miniature years later, stories of Louis XVI's last moments became morbidly iconic. Some claimed a crowd member soaked a handkerchief in his blood. Others said his heart was secretly removed and preserved. But the detail that stuck, the one whispered most often, was that final apology. A king, facing death, still more afraid of causing inconvenience than raising his voice. That, in the end, was Louis. Not a man of revolution, not a man of rebellion, just a man who stepped wrong, in policy, in escape, and quite literally, on someone's foot. As the guillotine grows quiet as you lie still now, let yourself drift back to that pale Paris morning. The scrape of wheels on cobblestones, the soft flutter of a scarf, the long shadow of the guillotine stretching across frost-covered stones, and in the middle of it all a man who once ruled millions, saying softly, "Pardon me." Not because of what history accused him of, but for a small misstep on the way to the end. And perhaps in that moment he was most royal of all. Tonight's tale begins not with bloodshed, not with war, but with laughter. Yes, laughter. The kind that builds slowly, that bubbles up, that turns into hiccuping gasps. The kind that takes over your chest until your eyes water and your stomach aches. And apparently the kind that can kill a king. Our story tonight centers around Chrysippus, a famous Stoic philosopher of ancient Greece. But just off stage, perhaps a few goblets deep into his evening, stood a lesser-known royal patron believed by some ancient sources to be among the very few monarchs who literally died laughing. So snuggle in, and let's follow this odd thread, woven from historical guesswork, philosophical footnotes, and one very intoxicated donkey. The philosopher, and the King Chrysippus of Soli was no king himself. He lived in the 3rd century BCE and was one of the great minds of Stoicism, an austere school of thought that emphasized self-control, reason, and virtue. But Stoics, like playwrights and scientists, needed royal support. Enter an unnamed Hellenistic. King or noble, a man of rank who had invited Chrysippus to dinner, or perhaps simply heard his story afterward. We don't know the king's name for certain. Ancient historians like Diogenes Laertius, who wrote centuries later, kept the focus on the philosopher. But the tale always includes a royal witness, a feast, and a punchline gone terribly, terribly wrong. So what happened? A donkey and too much wine. One day, according to legend, Chrysippus observed a donkey in his garden. The donkey had wandered in and found a bowl of figs and wine, both luxuries in the Greek world. The donkey began to eat, and drink more, and Soon the donkey became, there's no polite way to say this, very drunk. Picture it now. A swaying donkey, ears flopping, jaw slack, tail twitching out of rhythm, stumbling through a philosophical garden like an underaged guest at a symposium. Chrysippus, either struck by absurdity or looking to impress his friends, shouted, "Now give the donkey a cup of wine to wash down the figs." The scene, combined with the philosopher's dry delivery, reportedly sent the nearby royal into a fit of laughter, a long fit, a very long fit. So long, in fact, that his attendants became alarmed, and before they could revive him, he died. Laughed to death at the sight of a donkey eating figs and wine. Is that even possible, you may be wondering? Can someone truly die of laughter? Medical literature says, sort of, extreme laughter can cause asphyxiation, cardiac arrhythmia, or even a stroke in susceptible individuals. It's rare, but not impossible, especially in ancient times without medical intervention, and in a world where health was precarious and digestion was often fatal. A belly laugh might well be the final straw, but in this case the story survives not because of medical oddity, but because of the absurd contrast it paints. A king, or at least a wealthy noble, reduced to tears by a donkey drunk on wine. A philosopher, delivering a joke so potent it becomes lethal, and an empire where power meant little in the face of well-timed absurdity. A stoic's legacy, a king's collapse. The focus of the ancient sources is always Chrysippus. He's the one credited with the line, the image, the accidental weapon of comedy. The king remains nameless, faceless, a royal footnote to a philosopher's punchline, but that in itself is telling, because even when your name is carved in gold or sung by courtiers, history sometimes forgets you, especially if you die giggling at livestock. And yet the scene lingers, because it's funny and strange, and if you tilt your head just right, a little poetic. The irony of Stoicism as a philosophy taught detachment from pleasure, from grief, from emotion, and here was its foremost champion, Chrysippus, inadvertently inciting laughter so uncontrollable that it killed a royal patron. There's a delicious contradiction there, as if the universe, so fond of irony, couldn't resist twisting the teachings into one final fatal chuckle, from laughter to legacy. The donkey's drunken feast became a metaphor. Poets referenced it. Philosophers debated it. Even later, jesters told the tale, usually with exaggerated flair. Some said the donkey hiccuped. Others claimed it tried to climb a couch. But the core remained, that a king, surrounded by wine and wealth and wisdom, died because the image of a tipsy donkey was just too much. And perhaps in some strange way that's a beautiful thing, to die not in fear or pain or war, but in laughter. As you smile into sleep so, as you lie back now, soft and still, imagine a warm Grecian garden, fig, trees heavy with fruit, a breeze stirring the linen curtains, and in the center, a donkey wobbling across marble tiles, ears askew, tail flicking merrily, and nearby, a man in robes, laughing so hard he forgets for a moment that he is royal, and then, forgetting everything. Let the thought warm you, because sometimes the silliest stories are the ones that last longest, and sometimes it's better to laugh than to rule, even, especially, if it's your last. Tonight, as the chill of evening settles like mist on your windowsill, we ride north into the snowscapes of early 18th century Sweden. The forests stretch endlessly. The lakes are frozen mirrors, and from the icy haze emerges a young, stubborn, silent figure on horseback. This is Charles III, King of Sweden, a man raised for war, wrapped in silence, known as the Warrior King, or simply Carolus Rex. He was born for greatness, or at least for battle, and for most of his life, he seemed to think nothing else mattered. He slept in tents, ate with his soldiers, rode through storms with a jaw set like stone, but even stone can crack. And for all his stoic defiance, Charles's death came not by sword, not in a final glorious charge, but by a single slip, a frozen field, and a circumstance so undignified that his courtiers debated how to explain it for decades. Some say he was assassinated, others whisper, "The ice got him." Let's look closer. A king at war with the world, Charles XIII came to the throne in 1697 at the age of 15. Just 3 years later, Sweden found itself at war with a coalition of powerful enemies: Russia, Denmark, and Poland. The conflict would become known as the Great Northern War, and Charles would spend most of his adult life leading armies across Europe, from Narva to Poltava, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. He was a military prodigy, but he was also obsessed. Even after major defeats, Charles refused peace. He believed in destiny, in divine backing, in pushing forward even when there was nowhere left to push. He spent 6 years in exile in the Ottoman Empire, refusing to return home in defeat. When he finally did, Sweden was weary, broken, and teetering on collapse. Still, he marched. And in 1718 he laid siege to the fortress of Fredrikstad in what is now Norway. And there, on a cold December night, and came the end. The final night Charles was inspecting trenches near the fortress walls. It was dark, cold, wind howled. The king, as always, wore his uniform, his gloves, and his usual expressionless face. Suddenly, a shot rang out. He dropped. His head slumped forward. Silent. Still. A bullet. Straight through the left temple. His body was rushed away. His officers panicked. The siege ended. But from the very start, questions swirled. Who fired the shot? Was it a Norwegian sniper? Or was it one of his own men? You see, not all were loyal to Charles. Some believed his war obsession was killing Sweden, that his refusal to sign peace meant slow national suicide. So the story diverged. One version claims it was a lucky enemy musket ball. Another says a Swedish officer, fed up with endless war, loaded a button into his gun and fired it straight into the back of the king's head. But then came a third version, the one no one wanted to say too loudly, that Charles slipped. That while inspecting icy trenches, he fell, his pistol discharged, or his head struck a frozen stone, that no shot was fired at all. A king, a patch of ice, a fatal stumble, and that was it. The debate that wouldn't die Charles's body was autopsied not once, not twice, but 3 times. Once in the 18th century, once in the 19th, and again in the 20th century, when his coffin was reopened to examine the skull. Even with modern science, the cause of death remains uncertain. The hole was clean, but the angle strange. There was no powder burn, no clear path, which left everyone with the same conclusion. We know he died. We're just not sure how ridiculous it was, because while assassination sounds thrilling and war makes legends, a frozen misstep is just so ordinary, too ordinary for an emperor of war. And yet, somehow just believable enough. The warrior's weakest step, if Charles did die slipping on ice, it wouldn't be the first indignity of his campaigns. He had once tried to ride into Russia in winter, a decision as cold as it was foolish. His army starved, froze, was torn apart at Poltava by Peter the Great. He once survived being shot in the foot and rode for miles anyway. He was known to sit for hours without speaking, to live off bread and beer, to sleep in his boots. So for such a figure, so austere, so hard-edged, to die from a slip, a patch of frost, and a bump on the head, there's something almost poetic about it, as if the earth itself, tired of his endless marching, whispered, "Enough," as the snow falls quiet as. You breathe now. Let the silence of snow settle into your thoughts. Imagine the siege camps outside Fredrikstad, fires flickering, the crunch of boots on ice, the long shadows of soldiers who have marched too far for too long. And in the trench, a man too proud to yield, stepping forward. One step, one patch of ice, and then stillness. Perhaps there was no shot. Perhaps there was no traitor. Perhaps in the end the snow simply won. A cold legacy. Charles the Thien never married. He had no children. He left Sweden smaller, weaker, and exhausted. But he also left behind a strange kind of admiration for his discipline, his courage, his refusal to live small. And yet for all that, it may be his fall, not his fight, that we remember most. Because even the coldest warriors are still men, and even kings can slip. Tonight, as the wind outside brushes softly against the glass, we travel north to the craggy lands of 15th century Scotland, where clan rivalries clashed with royal ambition, and castles loomed over heathered moors like stone sentinels. Our story, is not about politics, though. It is about a cannon and a king who stood too close to it. Yes, this is the tale of James II of Scotland, a monarch with a love for gunpowder and pageantry, who met his end not on the battlefield, but beside his own artillery, in what may be the loudest and most abrupt exit in royal history. So pull the blankets up, close your eyes halfway, and listen to the story of the king who quite literally blew himself up. A reign of blood and steel, James II was born in 1430 and became king at the tender age of 6, following the assassination of his father, James I. The early years of his reign were dominated by regents and blood feuds, most notably the Douglas family, whose power rivaled the crown. By the time James took full control in his 20s, he had developed a fiery temperament and a deep distrust of the nobility. In 1452, he personally stabbed the Earl of Douglas during a tense dinner at Stirling Castle, reportedly shouting, "If you will not part with your allegiance, I will part you from your life." So yes, James was not exactly subtle, but he was also a reformer. He strengthened the monarchy, centralized power, and embraced new technology, especially the latest marvel from Europe, cannon warfare. And that, dear listener, was his undoing. The siege of Roxburgh Castle in the 1460, James II set his sights on Roxburgh Castle, a fortress held by the English deep in the borders. It was summer. The Scottish army laid siege. Among their weapons were several new bombards, early cannons so large and heavy they had to be moved by teams of oxen and aimed with cranes. James, ever the hands-on monarch, insisted on overseeing the artillery personally. He was fascinated by the technology. He inspected the gunpowder. He walked the firing lines. He even stood beside the gunners as they loaded and fired. It was dangerous, of course, but James was young, brave, and eager to prove himself. Then came the fateful day. One of the cannons, likely overloaded or poorly cast, exploded right beside him. A flash, a crack, and silence. The explosion was catastrophic. The cannon shattered, sending iron and wood fragments flying in all directions. One of those fragments struck James in the thigh, tearing through flesh and bone. He collapsed instantly. The wound was massive. Accounts say his leg was blown clean off, though more likely it was mutilated beyond saving. He bled out within minutes. Just like that, at age 29, the King of Scots was gone, felled not by sword or spear, but by his own cannon. A monarch who embraced innovation, undone by it. The aftermath, the Scottish army, stunned but determined, pressed on. Roxburgh Castle was taken. The king's widow, Mary of Guelders, declared her son James III the new king right there on the field, beneath flapping banners and drifting smoke. But the court was shaken. How do you write an obituary for a king who blew up? How do you explain that Scotland's brave reforming monarch was felled not in combat, but by a faulty fuse? The chroniclers struggled. Some blamed the English, suggesting sabotage. Others called it divine mystery. But no one could quite get around the fact that the king had simply stood too close, too curious, too bold, too trusting of a weapon not yet ready. When power meets powder, James II's death was a symbol of a turning age. Gunpowder was reshaping warfare. The age of armored knights was ending. Castles once thought impenetrable could now crumble in hours under cannon fire. James had embraced this change eagerly, but perhaps too eagerly. He treated the cannon not as a tool, but as a toy, and like a child who plays too close to a firecracker, he paid the price. The crack heard through time. The story lived on, not because it was noble, but because it was so unexpected. There's something strangely theatrical about it. A king in gleaming armor, cloak billowing in the summer breeze, pointing proudly at his siege engines, only to vanish in a flash of smoke and iron. It feels like a scene from a tragicomedy, and maybe it was. As night falls quietly, so now as you settle into your blankets, listen for the distant echo of that fateful cannon, the hiss of fuse, the crack of impact, the stunned silence that follows, and imagine a king, fiery, young, ambitious, taking one step too close. In that instant, all his reforms, his wars, his victories paused. Because even kings forget that some things are better admired from a distance, especially when they go boom. Tonight, as you lie in gentle stillness, drifting through quiet thoughts, we travel to the halls of ancient Persia, where stone lions guarded palace gates, and rulers sat on thrones adorned with gold and lapis lazuli. Our subject is King Kavad I, ruler of the Sasanian Empire in the 6th century CE, a man known for reform, resilience, and revival, a king who lost his throne, reclaimed it, and planned an empire that would stand toe-to-toe with Byzantium. And yet, despite all that grandeur, Kavad's final moment was caused not by a blade, a battle, or a betrayal, but by a dentist. Yes, the king who defied emperors, defeated revolts, and restructured his empire, was killed by a toothache. Let's open wide, take a deep breath, and gently examine the most fatal extraction in royal history. A king of many lives, Kavad, I ascended to the Persian throne in 488 CE during a period of unrest. Nobles jostled for power. Religious movements clashed. The treasury bled silver. But Kavad was clever. He flirted with social reform, supporting the radical Mazdakite movement that advocated for communal property and the redistribution of wealth. This made him popular with the poor and hated by the elite. He was deposed, imprisoned, and exiled, but he didn't stay down for long. With the help of the Hephthalites, an eastern tribal power, he returned with an army, reclaimed his throne in 498, and spent the next 3 decades modernizing the Sasanian state. He was, in short, a survivor, until his tooth started hurting. The royal molar crisis by the early 530s, Kavad was elderly, likely in his 70s. His health, as with many monarchs of age, was becoming more fragile. Then came the toothache. Sources do not agree on which tooth, but they all agree it became infected, painful, swollen, possibly obsessed. And unlike modern times, dental procedures in the 6th century were not exactly gentle. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, no sterile steel. Extraction was done with iron tongs, heated tools, and hopeful hands. The court physician advised removal. Kavad agreed. And that was the beginning of the end. The fatal. Procedure accounts are scarce and wrapped in speculation, but the tale goes like this. During the extraction, either through excessive bleeding or post-procedural infection, Kavad's condition worsened rapidly. He developed a high fever. His jaw swelled. He could not eat. He could not speak. And within days, the king of kings, the Shahanshah of the Sasanian Empire, was dead, felled by the humble molar. From molar to mausoleum, the empire was stunned. Kavad had ruled for over 40 years, reasserted Persian dominance, reformed administration, and fathered Khosrow, one of the greatest Persian kings. And yet, after decades of outmaneuvering generals, priests, and politicians, he was undone by oral hygiene. The court scrambled to frame his death with dignity. Some records omit the dental detail altogether, replacing it with sudden illness or divine calling. But others, especially Byzantine chroniclers, could not resist the irony. Procopius, ever eager to snicker at Persian misfortunes, noted how a small ailment of the teeth ended a ruler of such immense pride. The irony of royal vulnerability, Kavad's fate is striking not just because of its randomness, but because it's so intimate. We expect kings to die in grand moments, in battle, at court, in dramatic betrayal, not in a dental chair, or more accurately, a rug-covered stool with a grimacing barber surgeon standing over him. But that's what makes it memorable. Because, like us, Kavad ate, chewed, winced at cold water. And when infection came, there was no crown strong enough to hold it back. A legacy bitten short. Despite his unglamorous death, Kavad's legacy endured. He laid the groundwork for his son Khosrow to elevate the Sasanian Empire to one of its cultural and military peaks. But that final image of a ruler brought low by a swelling gum and a stubborn root remains a quietly haunting reminder that power can protect against many things, but not an abscess. As you rest, open wide, gently. Tonight, let your thoughts float to the vaulted halls of Ctesiphon, the scent of incense and parchment, the clink of silver cups, and deep within a chamber where a great king wrapped in fine robes sits back nervously as a man with blackened tools steps forward. A sharp tug, a sharp cry, and the beginning of the end. Not all empires fall in war. Some end with a tooth pulled too soon. As you breathe softly now, tucked in the safety of your own warm blankets, imagine a landscape far different. The blazing heat of Anatolia, the shimmer of sun on riverbanks, the sound of chainmail clinking gently as horses drink beside tired. Maine here in June of 1190, Frederick III Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, the red-bearded lion of the Germanic world, prepared to lead his army across the Third Crusade. He was in his late 60s, but still strong, still commanding. He had crossed the Alps, marched through Eastern Europe, and now stood on the edge of the Muslim world, ready to take Jerusalem for Christendom. And yet, this Iron Emperor, this living legend, met his end not by Saracen sword, nor by betrayal, nor even by illness, but by slipping into a river he had no business entering. Let's walk softly into the tale of an emperor who couldn't resist a dip and sank into silence, the red beard of Europe. Frederick Barbarossa, so named, for his Barbarossa, red beard, reigned as Holy Roman Emperor from 1155. He was both feared and admired, a ruler who balanced diplomacy with war and spent decades trying to subdue rebellious Italian cities while clashing famously with a series of popes. He was a man of great ambition, a unifier, a lawgiver, and by the time of his death, a legend. In his own lifetime, when Pope Urban III called for the Third Crusade after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, Barbarossa, despite his age, answered the call. And so, in 1189, he marched out from Germany with an army of tens of thousands, headed for the Holy Land. But the real danger, it turned out, was much closer than Jerusalem. Crossing Anatolia by mid-1190, Barbarossa's army had reached the Cilician region of southeastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The heat was suffocating. Food was scarce. Morale was fraying. As they approached the Göksu River, then known as the Salif, Barbarossa, either in haste or discomfort, decided to bathe. Some say he was trying to cool off. Others suggest he was attempting to cross the river on horseback. Either way, it didn't end well. The current was swift, his armor was heavy, and soon the emperor slipped beneath the surface. He drowned, just like that, the most powerful monarch in Europe, undone by a swim in the wrong place. Panic in the ranks. The imperial army was shattered. At first, there was denial, then disbelief. Had their emperor truly died in such a way? No battle, no last speech, just a splash and a few bubbles. In the sun, some reports claim his men tried to resuscitate him. Others said they fished out his body and packed it in vinegar to preserve it. Still others, embarrassed, horrified, claimed he had died from a heart attack before falling into the water or perhaps struck his head on a rock. But the most consistent version is the simplest and the most humiliating. He went for a dip and did not come back up. A holy death? Or a humbling one? To medieval minds, Barbarossa's death was awkward to say the least. How could God allow his champion, his warrior emperor, to die not at the hands of infidels but in a river? Chroniclers scrambled to spiritualize the event. Some said it was a test of faith. Others claimed it was divine mystery, a punishment for past arrogance or perhaps a symbolic baptism before heaven. But most agreed, it was a shock. His body was eventually buried in parts. Some say his flesh in Antioch, his bones in Tyre, and his heart in Tarsus. Though none of these claims are certain, his army, leaderless, fractured. The Third Crusade stumbled forward under Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus, but never fully recovered its momentum. And Barbarossa became a legend, not just for how he lived, but for how absurdly he died. A legacy soaked in irony. Frederick Barbarossa was a man of mountains and marble halls. His decrees had reshaped cities. His beard was said to glint like copper in the sun, and yet his ending felt like something out of a fable. The mighty emperor brought low not by treachery but by water. No armor could save him. No army could pull him back. He was, in the end, just another man who made a very bad swimming decision, as the water runs softly. So as you lie here now, listening perhaps to the faint memory of flowing water, think of the Guksu River, clear, unassuming, drifting gently past reeds and stones, and remember that on one quiet day long ago the surface broke, and an empire lost its heartbeat. History doesn't always roar, sometimes it gurgles, and even emperors can drown in less than a foot of water. As your thoughts begin to drift tonight, let us travel eastward, far beyond the deserts and rivers of Persia, into the fertile valleys and misty mountains of Han Dynasty China, where jade seals marked divine rule and emperors moved across palace corridors like living dragons. Our story centers on Emperor Jing of Han, a ruler who loved peace, philosophy, and games. He ruled during a time of relative stability, encouraging Confucian learning and limiting military aggression. But beneath the silk robes and courtly etiquette, he was also known for a very human trait. He hated losing, especially at Lubo, an ancient Chinese board game once played by nobles and scholars alike. And one day, it was Lubo that cost him his life, yes, not rebellion, not sickness, but a fatal board game tantrum. The quiet rule of Emperor Emperor Jing, born Liu Qi, was the sixth emperor of the Western Han Dynasty. He ascended the throne in 157 BCE, following the tumultuous reign of his father, Emperor Wen. Unlike his predecessors, Jing sought harmony. He reduced taxes. He eased legal punishments. He allowed Confucian scholars back into court. Historians often praise him for maintaining peace and prosperity, a rare feat in an age when palace intrigues could doom a dynasty overnight. But in his private life, Jing had a stubborn streak. He was known to argue with officials. And worse still, he had a temper at the game board. Lubo, the ancient pastime Lubo, was a strategy game, something between backgammon and chess. Played with dice and carved figurines, it was popular among Chinese elites for centuries. No one quite remembers the rules now. The game fell into obscurity over time. But what remains in history is how seriously the upper class took it, and Jing took it very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that he often played late into the night, sometimes with eunuchs, sometimes with favored ministers. And one fateful evening, he played with a palace official named Zhao Tan. The emperor loses. As the game unfolded, Jing grew increasingly irritated. Zhao Tan, cautious and clever, began to outmaneuver him. And then, in what must have been a tense, candlelit pause, the final move was made. Jing had lost. Again. And this time he didn't take it. Well, according to early court sources, the emperor flew into a rage. He stood, cursed, and with the imperial equivalent of flipping a table, hurled the heavy Lubo board toward Zhao Tan. But fate had other plans. The board, made of lacquered wood and jade inlays, rebounded off a column or the floor. Sources differ, and struck the emperor in the chest. Hard. So hard, in fact, that it fractured his sternum. He fell back, wheezing. Servants rushed in. The blow was not immediately fatal, but it triggered a chain reaction. Over the next few days, the emperor developed a high fever. Internal bleeding likely worsened. He struggled to breathe, and not long after, he died. From a board game. His final battle, not with a warlord or a traitorous prince, but with a game he himself had thrown. The court in shock, the court scrambled to cover the story. Jing was officially said to have died of sudden illness, but whispers spread quickly. Zhao Tan disappeared from records, likely exiled or quietly retired, and the tale was preserved in anecdotes, not annals, but it was too curious, too strange to be entirely buried. The emperor who built stability, undone by his own temper over a handful of dice. A lesson in stillness. There is, perhaps, something fitting in this strange demise. Jing had spent his reign trying to reduce violence, smooth chaos, and rule with measured calm. And yet, in private, his worst enemy was not an assassin or general. It was his own impulse, and a game, a small, silly game. It reminds us that even in marble palaces, the human heart remains fragile. Pride can tip a board, and rage can rebound. Literally, as the lanterns flicker so as you drift tonight, let your thoughts wander to the quiet chambers of Weiyang Palace. The scent of sandalwood, the flicker of oil lamps, the sound of dice rolling on wood, and a man, ruler of millions, face tightening as his pieces are swept from the board. Then silence. Then, a crash, and the slow creeping hush of consequence. Not all battles are fought with armies. Some are lost with a single toss of the hand, and sometimes, the board fights back. Tonight our journey carries us into the rugged hills of medieval Serbia, a land of fortresses, dense forests, and Byzantine politics tangled like grapevines in autumn. Here, beneath banners of saints and the scent of incense, ruled the Nemanjic dynasty, the greatest royal house of medieval Serbia. Revered, devout, often quarrelsome, its princes and kings shaped the soul of the Balkans, and among them stood a lesser-known figure, Stephen Uroš II, Milutin, a prince destined for kingship, whose early life was marked by struggle, diplomacy, and one of the most ignoble deaths ever whispered in royal corridors. Because despite courtly training, prayers, and ceremonial armor, Stephen died under the most unexpected of burdens. He was crushed by a horse, not in battle, not in a heroic charge, but in a moment of confusion and poor saddle choice. Let us step quietly into this tale of unfortunate footing. So, royal life on uneasy ground. Stephen Milutin was born into the powerful Nemanjic dynasty in the mid-13th century, a time when Serbia sat at the crossroads of empires, wedged between Catholic Hungary, Orthodox Byzantium, and the rising Ottoman, presence far to the south. His father, King Uroš I, had ambitions for his sons. Milutin, though not firstborn, was educated in both Latin and Greek, trained in arms and prepared to rule if fate or politics required. He was eventually crowned King of Serbia in 1282 and would rule for over 4 decades. But before all that, before alliances, monasteries, or campaigns, Stephen experienced a moment so bizarre, so sudden, that the royal scribes hesitated to describe it fully, because in his younger years, while attending a military procession, he mounted a horse that had not yet been fully secured, and the horse panicked. The fatal mounted happened near a hilltop fortress, perhaps Ras, perhaps Skopje, records are vague. Stephen, likely trying to impress foreign guests or fellow nobles, leapt upon a black stallion just as it was being fitted with a new ceremonial saddle. But the saddle was not tightened. The cinches hung loose. The horse reared, spooked either by the weight or the crowd. Stephen, clinging tightly, slid sideways, pulling the entire saddle with him. Then the horse stumbled and fell, right on top of him. Not hooves, not kicks, just weight. A sudden, inescapable, crushing force. Witnesses rushed to help, but it was too late. His ribs were shattered, his lungs likely punctured. He gasped once, twice, and was still. Death by horse, not in war. To die in battle was expected. To die assassinated, poisoned, or betrayed, sadly common, but to die in what amounts to a saddle-testing accident? It was almost too much for the royal image makers. Chroniclers in Serbia chose their words carefully. Some wrote, "He was taken by sudden misfortune while in the saddle." Others said, "The Lord called him during the preparation for ceremony," but the truth filtered through. A saddle slip, a toppled horse, and a prince pinned beneath a beast he had once mastered. The court's dilemma. There were two problems. It was embarrassing. A prince dying without dignity was bad for morale. It was avoidable. Someone had failed to secure the saddle properly. Was it sabotage, incompetence, or haste? A minor investigation followed. One stable boy vanished from the records. A squire was reassigned to monastery service, but most agreed it was no one's fault and everyone's misfortune, especially Stephen's. The irony of royal training Stephen had been trained in warfare, swordplay, philosophy, religious rites. He could quote St. Augustine and debate liturgy, but he had not been trained to check his own cinch strap. And that, perhaps, was the fatal flaw. For all the grandeur of royalty, even the simplest oversight, one buckle, one loose strap, can unseat a destiny, literally, from stallion to silence. The horse, by the way, survived. It was said to have bolted after falling, wild-eyed and snorting. Some claimed it never allowed a rider again. Others said it was sacrificed, in mourning. But perhaps in the deep heart of this tale, the horse was simply a mirror. Beautiful, strong, and subject to panic when mishandled, like all monarchies, like all men. As hooves fade into the night, so as you lie quietly now, with only the hush of your own breath to guide you, imagine the highlands of Serbia, the crackling of pine underfoot, and a young prince dressed in his finest cloak, one foot in the stirrup, one hand on the reins, and then a slip, a thud, a silence that no coronation can cure. Because sometimes a throne is not stolen, it is simply flattened. Tonight, as we arrive gently at the final chapter of our journey through history's most embarrassingly human royal departures, we pause in Rome. Not the idealized marble Rome of Caesar or Augustus, but the flamboyant, chaotic, incense-drenched Rome of the 3rd century, a place where purple was power and scandal wore a crown. Here ruled Elagabalus, one of the most controversial emperors the Roman world had ever seen. A teenager cloaked in silks, priest of a foreign sun god, draped in perfume and extravagance. His rule was brief, intense, and by most accounts completely unorthodox. And yet, for all his wild decisions, what truly undid him was not a plot at first, nor poison, nor even sword, but gravity. Yes, tonight we close with the tale of an emperor who fell from his own throne and never got up again. The meteoric rise Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus Bassianus, was raised in Syria and became emperor at just 14 years old, largely thanks to the ambitions of his grandmother, Julia Maesa, and the legion's fatigue with his cousin, Emperor Caracalla. His real name was replaced with Elagabalus, after the god he served, Elagabal, a sun deity whose cult was central to his upbringing. When he arrived in Rome in 218 CE, he came not just with soldiers but with new gods, new ideas, and an appetite for chaos. He wore makeup, hosted banquets with edible sculptures, and tried to replace Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods, with his eastern sun deity. He also shocked the Senate, the army, and the nobility with a series of marriages, rumored gender identity fluidity, and preference for dancing in priestly robes rather than issuing laws. To conservative Romans, he was a scandal incarnate. To the palace, he was a crisis waiting to happen. The throne incident amid this turmoil. One story whispered through the halls of the Palatine stands out, a tale not recorded in polished inscriptions, but muttered with barely stifled smirks among imperial servants. One morning, Elagabalus entered the Senate chamber to preside over some minor ceremonial honors. He arrived late, robed in gold and with too many rings on too many fingers. He stepped forward toward the imperial throne, a gilded, high-backed seat raised upon a small platform, and missed his footing. Accounts vary slightly. Some say he tripped on his own robe. Others say his shoes, richly jeweled and impractical, caught on the steps, and a few gleeful scribes hint that perhaps someone nudged him. But the result was the same. Elagabalus fell, forward, down the shallow stairs, twisting sideways, and then he hit the marble floor. Not a gentle slip. A thud, echoed by the chamber's stunned silence. Then, the Emperor did not get up. The aftermath, what followed, was panic, then confusion. Attendants rushed forward. Physicians were summoned. Elagabalus had dislocated his neck or suffered a spinal injury, according to one account. Another claimed the blow triggered a seizure or exacerbated a condition he'd long hidden. Either way, the event, though not instantly fatal, marked the beginning of the end. He became weak. His public appearances ceased. Rumors swirled that the gods were punishing him for blasphemy. Within weeks, his grandmother and the Praetorian Guard had seen enough. The fall had symbolically unseated him, and now they made it literal. He was assassinated in 222 CE, his body thrown into the Tiber. But many believe the decision was solidified the moment he fell from his throne. Because in Rome, more than anywhere, optics were everything, and the emperor had slipped. A fall greater than power. In retrospect, the physical fall of Elagabalus was more than a stumble. It was a metaphor. Here was a boy king, worshipper of the sun, wrapped in silk and incense, trying to balance spiritual theater with absolute authority. And all it took was one misstep, and the illusion shattered. Thrones, it turns out, are just furniture. And power, if not balanced carefully, tips easily. The legacy that tumbled. One Elagabalus was remembered not for laws, victories, or reforms, but for how out of place he was in Roman tradition, and how swiftly and awkwardly his rule collapsed. He became a cautionary tale, not just for his eccentricities, but for the very humanity of his ending. A fall, a stunned hush, a boy blinking at marble and wondering if it was all over, and not long after, it was. As you sink into sleep, so now let your thoughts drift to that quiet imperial chamber, the scent of myrrh, the glint of gold, a small flight of stairs, and at the top, a throne too tall for balance. A foot slips, silk catches, a god emperor falls, and history, so often written in battle and blood, this time turns on a single step. Because even in marble halls with the world watching, the smallest mistake can echo forever. And sometimes, the fall from power is not symbolic, it's literal.